Thank you to the organisers for inviting us to talk about this very interesting topic of ethics in the field of archaeology. This is the outcome of an encounter between Paul Letter, a legal mind, and myself, an archaeologist. I have been asked to produce samples of burial grounds, and it's an issue that I was not able to find an answer to. Of course, Spinoza has said we have free will, but I have the rigor of a scientist, so I have been trying to find out an answer what to do with it, not being a legal mind. Paul Letter is going to help us as a specialist in social law. So our research has led to more questions than answers, and we're going to present to you this paper on archaeological remains between archaeological science, sensitivity, beliefs, and secular society. So human remains are not part of matter, but they are living things. So it is not subject to the law regarding property. As we said earlier, they cannot be bought and sold. The human body is, by definition, inviolable and inalienable, and even beyond death. It affects not only profitable interactions, but also when the general interest is at stake. This does not exclude the use of bodies for scientific or pedagogical ends. For around 40 years, the multiplication of the number of excavations and of major burial grounds has led to a considerable increase in bone remains, and this, of course, requires a lot of space in order to be stored. Archaeology has a public service mission according to the law. It's pedagogical, defined in the general interest according to the Constitutional Council as it decided in relation to preventive archaeology. This reconciliation between the general interest and respect due to human bodies allows us to preserve the integrity of these collections. It is an ambitious aim which affects the role of managers of these collections. We are trying to reduce the cost of the excavation itself and also carry out the necessary sampling. Yet, as envisaged in the discipline, sampling is the constitution of a collection from a defined set. Without knowledge of the whole collection as it is at the beginnings, there are often partial excavations where we are asked only to look at a small sample, so we are sampling a sample. In order for this to be statistically valid, you have to fulfill certain conditions, certain criteria. There has to be homogeneity, there has to be a random distribution, what we call randomization of the item samples, and then it has to be reproducible in order to be statistically significant and representative of the entire population. This is rather more difficult to do with living people, as it is a very varied group. It's easier to do with surveys of people when we have socio-professional categories, age brackets, and so on. But in archaeological remains, we just have probability of the belonging of individuals to a particular group, so it's a lot more difficult. also the population studied in archaeology do not ever reflect the living populations. So living groups are governed by three factors: our culture. We're not the same in Papua New Guinea, in Thailand, and in France. Demography, the families, the number of children in a group, and then also the environment. And then the living world is not the same as the dead people in that environment, because there will be migrations, exoduses, and so on. There will be differing rights, funeral rights, as we discussed earlier today, partial excavation, taphonomy selection, erosion, so on will influence this. Something that's well known to us, archaeoanthropologists, that was discussed in the 1990s, so Paul Sillier, who is here, is that we are trying to identify these different forms in our studies. So we want the populations that we are excavating to reflect something, a sort of slightly altered reflection of the population at the time. If these archaeological archives are not created today, they will not be able to exist in the future. If the idea is to preserve just one of the representative elements of the whole collection, what criteria should be applied to this? We can imagine this for standardized series, for ceramics and for coins, but for human remains it's a lot more difficult to do. Representativity, what does this mean? At what level are we talking about? Morphology, pathology, family links, funeral rites, practices? So while matter can be classified, human remains are rather more difficult to classify. And this is what this variability is the focus of our study. I have not been able to identify selection criteria. So I think it is very important to be able to go back to the collections, the entire collections. These are ultimately the remains that are going to be archived. Faced with the fact that it's impossible to define objective criteria, very often these collections are studied a second time. Students are continually calling on archaeoanthropologists such as myself to go back and look at and re-examine remains, looking at it from a different angle, from a different method. And this is how research has led to refine outlooks and results. And there are different methods according to the different discipline. While archaeological studies are rarely exhaustive, so often due to lack of means or time or skills, archiving collections means that you can go back to this for verification, for publication, or for reassessment for reproducibility of the results. We could also sometimes when the methods, the research methods, and the conclusions are questions, this is necessary. Very often, people want to know where they can access the remains. For the last 10 years, strict ministerial rules apply to the storage and the conditioning. Everything is labeled, and skeletons are all geo-referenced. These inventories take a lot of time initially, but they make it easier further down the line to go back to the collections. It would be unfortunate to be separated from these perfectly well archived and stored collections. This has to be done in the name of the general interest of archaeology, and this purpose has still to be stipulated. These are libraries of data. If the idea that they could be reinterred, these collections could be reinterred, would have to assume that they have been perfectly well inventoried in the beginning. We mustn't forget that these human remains are also part of our history. It is our archaeological heritage. We ask about the respect for the tombs, while at the same time calling on reconstruction of our history. Each skeleton has a different story. Each of us tells a story, and it is the sum of all of this that gives us an archaeological story. The possibility of exhuming them in an ethical manner to allow us to put together this story, and also sometimes to refute racial and other theories are fundamental. So these tombs are they tell a story. They are a library of information. Studying these remains is an undeniable opportunity that allows us to learn about the funeral rites and practices and mannerisms of the past. We can also find the responses of our ancestors as regards death. In each community, we know that there are some rules and subjects. The personalization, the characterization of these groups allows us to address the question of inequality in funeral practices and treatment. Anthropological analysis of all of their different types, including genomics, these days allow us to create a kind of archaeological ID card of the skeletons, the sex, morphology, even their DNA and even their microbiome these days can be reconstructed using data tools, photonumeric data. We can cross all of this information in anthropological studies, rather than simple physical characterization of individuals, seeks to understand the cultural practices that governed the society, identify the norms, and see what were the outliers. Archaeology and anthropology explained this human evolution. Skeletization of bodies is another area beyond just purely sanitary burial for sanitary reasons. It's also a symbolic act. The tomb leaves a trace as gradually the memory of the individual disappears. One or two generations later, the deceased person disappears and is no longer in living memory, whereas the tombs and the rituals that accompany it can still be identified many years later. It's we have a series of clues. These are sometimes inscriptions on coffins or alongside the burial ground, and these are suggestions of the identity. They are not definitive identifications. These are not absolute, cannot be verified by DNA. So the objectives of past is not to restore them to these families. The means dedicated to the means dedicated to these excavations is not intended to return the remains to the descendants of these individuals or some distant family member. And yet they are reburied, reinterred a second time. Why is this? This may seem contradictory. Faced with the impossibility of preserving the bodies in the medium to short term, because these are bodies that are decomposing, at least partially decomposing, and not embalmed or mummified bodies. So there is an invasive autopsy with lots of sampling with a forensic team at Toulouse. So here in this case, the reinterment is not an ethical consideration. It is just the material and sanitary requirements. After the autopsy, the body had to be disposed of in some way, and it could not be preserved. It could be preserved in a refrigeration chamber. But is it more ethical to reinter the body? There was a French ceremony at a cemetery 300 kilometers away from where it was found. Is it down to archaeologists to decide what is appropriate? The legal ambiguities led to the creation of a group that was discussed earlier today at the subdirection of archaeology at the Ministry of Culture. This is an interesting question also for archaeoanthropologists, thinking specifically of a team in Marseille that put together a group or a think tank on this issue in Marseille and the availability of space in these excavation deposit archives. Thank you very much, Rosen. If I can just come back to the presentation that was made earlier, I'm not a specialist in the law or governing archaeology that some of you, or some people who spoke earlier today. I am a jurist, a researcher and a lecturer. I'm interested in forensic science, medical technology and social law, and I would like to just add a different perspective from a legal discipline that is perhaps runs alongside archaeology law. And I think maybe there are some interesting things that can be said. As regards what has been said so far, as Rosen has mentioned, and she came to see me also to ask these questions, I think there are very strong resonances with the legal area, health law and social law, and more generally in civil law has been mentioned already. The question of human person, I think, was sort of an agitating force in the debate earlier today. It seems to me that the law of the human person, what do jurists understand really from this notion of a legal person, as a human person, physical person? There are two main points. We talk about this in the standard person. A person in law, in legal terms, can carry out a number of legal transactions. In order to enter into a contract, you have to be able to identify entities, legal entities. Sometimes these are moral persons, physical persons. Sometimes they are legal persons. And so we call them legal subjects. But that is necessary in order to enter into a legal transaction. But a human person is a different thing, a more recent notion, but it has a distinct legal function. And here there are three images here to try to explain this, because these are symbolic representations of these notions. These are mental constructions that we're talking about in law. So there are three figures. This is my interpretation, and there will be others, I think, that are possible as well. Three legal figures. I think these are legal figures in different, each of them in different ways, that we could potentially be understood as being a human person. In the driving code, a person, you can see they're represented by the zebra crossing, someone that could be run over. UNICEF has an overriding role of protecting human beings, so the human person again. And here, Da Vinci with technical sciences that I think is very closely linked to what we're talking about today, which can be confused with legal fields, I think. In French history, there is a very well-known affair, that of the launch of the dwarf in the 1980s in a small town in Montcey-sur-Orge in the 1980s, or perhaps 1990. Anyway, the Council of State used this principle of the human dignity to force the municipal authorities to forbid, ban this private practice, this immoral, unethical practice of that was done in a disco, in a club, and so the municipal authorities banned this practice. And the question was, did the mayor have authorization to do so in the name of the dignity of the human person? And they found that in this case, the administrative authorities did have the right to do so. Now, this decision to ban went against the rights, supposedly, of the people involved, and because the dwarf in question, that was his job, he claimed the right to continue this activity. And so the notion of human person, according to this standard of the protection of human dignity, in law serves to protect individuals, and sometimes this can be applied against the will of the person in question, who can be caught up individually in this kind of moral or ethical debate. What I wanted to add to this legal notion of human persons and protection of dignity in the contemporary period, this is quite a porous definition of the human person across a number of fields. Law manages, in a particular way, madness, for example, and recognizes the way that an individual person is no longer of sane mind in various circumstances. The border with, the question of the delimitation of animals is also rather porous, rather vague. Human persons, should this be applied to the great apes, to notions regarding biodiversity and so on. And also it is a vague, porous notion when it comes to inorganic matter, and we may well wonder whether artificial intelligence could potentially one day become the equivalent of a human person, which should be protected by law. At any rate, what I'm trying to say is that this is an organic border. At what point after death is there no longer a human? Are we no longer dealing with a human person? I think this has already been discussed this morning. There is no time-limited criteria. There is no material criterion to tell us at which point. I mean, earlier today we mentioned a particular amount, 3 grams of a body was needed for sampling. I didn't have time to get into it with Mr. Chalier, but I think this deserves to be discussed. But what are the criteria? At any rate, the law does not stipulate at what point we have the disappearance, at what point the human person disappears. We just know that at some point we're dealing with a slightly different type of material, substance, so the human body. It is no longer a human person. So the law can be rather ambivalent. Hence this image before you now. Amongst the questions raised by Rosen was the question of identity. I can see that I'm going a little over time, so I will try and wrap up briefly. But identity. Does an identified body raise issues that are different to those of an unidentified body? The current state of the law doesn't really make any or draw any archaeological distinctions, even though there may be a requirement to try and identify the descendants if a body has been identified. So that can be significant, but the identification technique in the law, I think, is quite specific, and I don't know if it should be mobilized without due caution. Well, what is identification? Identity is a technique that allows us to place an individual within a broader population using material means, registered identification numbers, and so on. And you can see I have used myself as my own guinea pig, because that is my ID card. These are legal parts of my identity. Is that really my identity? Well, these are 4 versions of my legal identity. And each time this refers to a different database with a different numerical identifier and different legal and normative uses. Now, the important thing about this is that identity techniques in law serve a purpose, and this is always a matter of surveillance, control, checking, verification of a particular legal operation, depending on the case of, say, Social Security identification. It allows the Social Security Services to see who exactly is consuming health services amongst the number of insured people, and it allows us to ensure that it is the appropriate people who are benefiting from these services. And the same can be applied to others. The SNCF, the French National Rail, wants to know who is using their services, and they invent this form of identification using legal identity. And so what I wanted to say to Rosen was that the specificity of this technique, I don't think, cannot be transposed to the future of their descendants, simply because these are techniques that do not have any objects. If we take the example of Louise de Cango, there were techniques at the time that gave the person an identity, but are these still applicable today? No, I don't think so. But it is interesting from a scientific point of view. So alongside legal identities, there are identities, forms of identity that other forms of knowledge can use. And personally, I think that my identity is not exactly the same as the identity that is represented by the cards that you can see here. So I think I will close there, because I've run out of time. Thank you.